Ladies and gentlemen, when you think of Dracula, think of the different actors who played him. Bela Lugosi, Frank Langella, Christopher Lee, Gary Oldman. Which one have we forgotten? Well, there's two hints, two words. Dan Curtis and Bram Stoker's Dracula. Yes. Jack Palance, of all people, did a very good job of Bram Stoker's Dracula, the original movie to be titled Bram Stoker's Dracula. And this came out in 1974. Stoker, I always say Stoker. Bad Canadian pronunciation. Dracula, also known as Bram Stoker's Dracula and Dan Curtis's Dracula, him of the great Dark Shadows fame and Kolchak the Night Stalker. It's a 1974 British made-for-TV gothic horror film, an adaptation of Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula. Now, teleplay was by Richard Matheson, and of course directed by Dark Shadows creator Dan Curtis, with the great Jack Palance in the title role. It was the second collaboration for Curtis and Palance after the 1968 TV film The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Now, this was commissioned through CBS, which was the distributor, with the running time of 100 minutes, and the production company was Lat Glen Limited. Now, as the story goes, and it's a pretty good story. Bistritz, Hungary, May 1897. Natives in Transylvania seem afraid when they learn solicitor Jonathan Harker is going to Castle Dracula. Jonathan finds the Count abrupt and impatient to get things done. Dracula reacts very strongly to a photograph of Harker's fiancée Mina and her best friend Lucy. After preventing his dead brides from devouring Harker, he forces the young solicitor to write a letter saying he will be staying in Transylvania for a month. Harker climbs down the castle walls and finds Dracula's coffin, but it's attacked and knocked out by one of Dracula's gypsy servants before he can stake Dracula. They later throw him in the lower depths of the main crypt, where the brides attack him again. A juicy scene, no doubt. The debitor runs around ground carrying only Dracula and a dead captain lashed to the wheel. Soon after, Lucy begins to fall ill. Her fiancé, Arthur, is perplexed and calls in the great Dr. Van Helsing. The doctor starts to recognize what might be happening, especially after Lucy walks out of her home at Hillingham and is found drained of blood under a tree the next morning. Dracula has flashbacks of his wife, of whom Lucy is a spitting image, on her deathbed centuries earlier. Now, Lucy's mother is in a room with Mina when Dracula comes calling the last time, a wolf that shatters the window. Lucy soon rises from the dead and comes to the window of Arthur's home, begging to be let in on the glass. Arthur does so, delighted and amazed she's alive, unaware that she is now a vampire under Dracula's control. This very nearly gets him bitten, but Van Helsing interrupts with a cross, causing her to flee. They go to Lucy's grave and drive a wooden stake into her heart. When Dracula comes to the tomb later and beckons to her, he goes berserk upon finding that she's fully and truly dead. Jack Palance says the freaking out Dracula has to be seen and believed. I saw it in French in the late 1970s, and let me tell you, he outacted everybody in that scene. Now, Mina tells Van Helsing about the news story about the Demeter, the boxes of earth, and Jonathan going to meet Dracula to sell him a house. From these clues, Van Helsing and Holmwood go about finding all but one of Dracula's boxes of earth containing his native soil in which a vampire must rest. But back at the hotel, the vampire hunters discover Dracula is there seeking revenge. He has bitten Mina and, before their eyes, forces her to drink blood from a self-inflicted gash in his chest. All that they love, all that is theirs, he will take, he says. So you see the parallels with this with Bram Stoker's Dracula by Coppola, and we'll talk about that in a second. The tracking of Dracula back to his home commences with Van Helsing hypnotizing Mina. Via the bond of blood, she sees through Dracula's eyes and discovers where he's headed. At the castle, Van Helsing and Holmwood find and stake the brides. Jonathan, now a rabid and bloodthirsty vampire, attacks Arthur and Van Helsing, but in the struggle is knocked by Arthur in a pit of spikes and killed. The final confrontation with Dracula takes place in what looks like a grand ballroom. The cross is wielded by the two men, or something Dracula doesn't seem to want to look upon. Dracula does get the better of them, ridding them of their crosses. Van Helsing pulls down the window curtains and sunlight pours in. Dracula is weakened, finally going dormant long enough for Van Helsing to pierce his heart with a long spear. Eventually, they leave him there. Before the portrait of a living warrior Dracula, with Lucy's look-alike in the background, a text scrolls across the screen about a warlord who lived in the area of Hungary known as Transylvania. and always said he had found a way to conquer death, a legend no one has ever disproven. So left it open for a sequel. So Jack Palance plays Count Dracula or Vlad The Impaler. Simon Ward as Arthur. Nigel Davenport as Van Helsing. Fiona Lewis, very, very luminous, as Lucy Westerhan. Maria Dracula's deceased wife. Murray Brown as Jonathan Harker. Penelope Horner as Bina Murray. Pamela Brown as Mrs. Wentera. Sarah Douglas, Virginia Wetherall, and Barbara Lindley as Dracula's three wives. George Pravda as the innkeeper, Hannah Marie Pravda as the innkeeper's wife, Reg Lyle as zookeeper, John Chalice as Stockton-on-Tees clerk, and John Pennington as the main shipping clerk. Now, Curtis decided to film Bram Stoker Dracula in two locations, what was then Yugoslavia, where the old castles in Quiet Land, and England, where the remainder of the story is set. Now, the initial CBS broadcast in October 1973 was preempted for an address by Richard Nixon on the resignation of Spiro Agnew. Instead, it was broadcast almost 5 months later in February 1974. CBS took advantage of the successful release of director Francis Ford Coppola's identically titled adaptation Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1992 to rebroadcast the film on 28 November 1992, 2 weeks after Coppola's film opened. Not for Halloween, but close enough. Now, according to a featurette on the DVD for the film, Jack Palance was offered a role of Dracula several more times after his first performance of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but he turned them all down. The original title was Bram Stoker's Dracula. The film was also released under the title on VHS and Laserdisc. Now, Francis Ford Coppola and Columbia Pictures purchased the rights to that title in the early 1990s. Coppola wanted to make it clear that his Dracula movie was unlike any other Dracula movie before it. Coppola's film also takes inspiration from the two key elements in Curtis's film that separated it from other adaptations, making the Dracula character and the historical Dracula, Vlad The Impaler, one and the same person, and a reincarnation romance with Dracula's dead wife, which in this movie was Lucy instead of Mina as in Coppola's movie. Nearly all home video releases of Curtis's film have since been released under the title Dan Curtis Dracula or simply Dracula. Now, the Marvel comic series, The Tomb of Dracula, does feature a Dracula whose appearance was based on Jack Palance. Palance had at that point yet to play Dracula in Tomb of Dracula. Arcla's Gene Colan got the idea from Palance's performance in Dan Curtis's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, in which he appeared in 1968. Now, the reason why Palance was looked upon as a potential Dracula because of his mid-European looks and overall strength as an actor. Jack Palance, a very handsome man, can be very scary. He played a lot of villains and a lot of major movies, including Shane, and of course he's a short but essential part in the redo of Batman with Tim Burton in 1989, and there's kind of a parody of his Dracula's speaking voice in one scene where he's talking to Jack Nicholson, and another scene after Palance's character's murder where Nicholson is talking like this. You are my number one. Jack Palance had a very specific way of speaking. Now, television was good to Jack Palance, and he did a lot of TV, including Twilight Zone, various Canadian movies, he was only big on the big screen with City Slickers, but for years he had established himself as a tremendous TV actor. And I think CBS made a huge mistake to not look at this as a possible series. Not say with Jack Palance, but like in a series of movies. I would like to see, Return of Dracula or Dracula's Revenge, because he did it with Christopher Lee. But see, with Jack Palance, he looked like Dracula. With Christopher Lee, you had to make his eyes bloodshot. Christopher Lee looked like kind of a British ghoul at times, and that's why you could play more than just Dracula or Frankenstein's monster or whatever. But Christopher Lee, bloodshot eyes, does not Palance, I can't hold a candle to Christopher Lee as Dracula, because Christopher Lee had that Shakespearean style. But Jack Palance was a little bit more sexual, and for CBS to do a certain movie where he had three wives, I know there's certain scenes in there where he whips them up into a frenzy. I can imagine what his wedding night would have been like. A lot of strange occurrences in the castle, as we say. So I saw the movie in 1977 in French. I give it 3.5 stars out of 4. Really enjoyed it. But in French, it takes a different connotation altogether to see Jack Palance speaking a mixture of Quebecois and Acadian French with Dracula's key lines. It has to be seen to believe. And you could probably get the audio track on the DVD. Now, I think the Blu-ray DVD is still available. You could probably get it through Amazon or distribution. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, they have a making of featurette and talking about the legacy of Dan Curtis as it becomes with these many Draculas, as we like to say. Because Dan Curtis liked his Dracula, as we know. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you like what we're doing here with our horror vintage podcast on TV and movies of that genre, late 60s, early 70s, including Night Gallery, talk about the Dan Curtis oeuvre, Twilight Zone, in the 60s towards the revivals. Let us know what to like, comment, and subscribe. And don't forget, you're only good as your last movie. And Dan Curtis, he always left his fans with something to watch. He was never boring. He may have been repetitive or he would steal from himself, but he was never boring. A Dan Curtis movie, directed or created or whatever, is a pleasure to watch. Thanks for listening. Bye.